There are fewer tech jobs. Well, there are fewer tech jobs being posted at all, but even fewer of those that are now listing remote work. In more hierarchical cultures, we have seen more resistance to remote work.
Welcome to International Business Today, where we discuss the most critical issues in international business through the lens of cutting-edge research. At Northeastern University, we're committed to disseminating use-inspired research. As academic leaders in the field of international business and strategy, this podcast is dedicated to helping global business professionals get through the noise. We want you to know the facts to make better decisions and policies. I'm Paula Caligiuri, professor at Northeastern University in the International Business and Strategy Group. With me today is my colleague, Executive Professor Barbara Larson from the Management and Organizational Development Group at Northeastern University. Barbara's expertise is in the skills needed for effective remote work. Today, Barbara will be sharing the practices that help make global virtual teams successful. Barbara, welcome to International Business Today.
Thank you, Paula. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is such an important topic ever since 2020, right? Since COVID, everyone's been talking about virtual work, remote work,
That's
and they've been
right.
doing it themselves. But you were interested and you were studying this topic before then. So what got you into this?
Yeah, it's a great question. My original interest in it came out of my own work experience, because before I was an academic, I actually worked for manufacturing companies doing mostly finance and a little bit of operations. And I was primarily doing international finance. And so I was actually, in some cases, a member of, and in other cases, a leader of global virtual teams. And then, fast forward, I go get my doctorate, I become a professor in management. And my first year of teaching, I thought, there are really some specific skills associated with doing the virtual work, thing better. And that I had learned over the years. I had been in some really bad situations and some really good situations. And so I wanted to be able to teach my, basic sort of organizational behavior students some of those skills. So I went out to first the teaching materials, as any good professor does. They try to, take what's already out there. And I was really shocked that there was very little out there. And so then I thought, okay, well, I'll go to the research and figure out what these skills are from a research perspective, and I'll use that to build my own teaching materials. Got to the research and found there was some, but it was really shockingly light at that time. And so this would have been around 2013 or so. And so at that point, I thought, oh, well, this is, as any good researcher does, that, when you see a gap, you go, oh, this is an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so then the long version of the story is that I went to a teaching conference summer of 2013 with that question. And I actually ran a workshop at that teaching conference that was, teaching virtual work skills, but a large part of that workshop was actually trying to figure out what other participants were doing to teach these skills. It turns out that Aaron Macarius, a professor at University of Akron, was at the same conference, basically running a very similar workshop. And so that's how Aaron and I met in 2013. And then we started to work on these questions, particularly around the individual experience of virtual work. So there had been some research done already on how team dynamics operate virtually, but less that was looking at the individual's experience of that, whether it was on a team or just on their own. And so Aaron and I got very interested in how do individuals experience virtual work and what are the skills that they need in order to be able to do this more effectively.
Yeah, and I can imagine now that idea, and you've been studying this for 10 years, but now it seems like so many people have virtual work or remote work affecting part of their jobs. Oh, yeah. Many do. What's the magnitude of this change that you've seen, either going past pre-COVID or now?
It was a gigantic shift in it. So if you look at the overall sort of trajectory of virtual work, it was, and here I'm gonna talk, the numbers that we have aren't really on global virtual teams. They're more on remote work, on people working from home, right? And so that's where we've seen the huge explosion in the last few years. People started doing this as early as like the late 70s, early 80s. IBM, it's this famous story about how they sent 5 of their employees home with these, gigantic terminals, right, back then,
Right.
in 1979, and eventually by the early 80s, it was something in the thousands of employees working from home, of course, on dedicated IBM terminals. The idea of remote work being a possibility in the workplace and working from home sort of started gradually growing from then. It picked up a little more steam in the late 90s and early 2000s when the technology caught up with the idea. But then, of course, in March of 2020, that's where everything just blew up. So in February of 2020, most people would say, most economists and labor economists would have said there's about 5% of work days being conducted in the US being conducted from home or from outside the office. That within a period of a few weeks went up to some estimates were as high as 70%
Wow.
of the population.
So from 5 to 70.
Yeah,
70%.
yeah, in a
Wow.
matter of weeks.
Oh,
And then, so what we've seen then is, as you can imagine, it's very much gone along with the pandemic rules, right? So we've had, this huge spike in March of 2020, and then, it leveled off probably around 60% for a couple of months. And then as we got into summer of 2020 and things started loosening up a little bit, it started to go down. And we've mostly seen it decrease since then. But it has leveled out around 28, 29% of total days worked in
and do
the
you
US.
think that's where it will stay?
So this is the
Right?
$10 million question, right? If I knew that, I'd be, probably in commercial real estate or something right now.
Right.
I think that, as I look to the future, I think that it is certainly going to stay well north of 5%. I don't think we're ever going to see those days again. Will it stay at 29, 28, 29, 30% like it is now? I would guess it's going to end up somewhere in the 20% range. I think there will be a continual, particularly if the labor market, slows down, if demand for labor slows down, then we'll start to see employers having more power, and some employers then saying, hey, we were hiring, but we want you back in the office. Just this week, there was a report that there are fewer tech jobs. Well, there are fewer tech jobs being posted at all, but even fewer of those that are now listing remote work
Right.
as part of the job. So I do think you'll see that downward pressure a little bit more. Probably over the next 2 years is my guess. And then, we'll settle in, the equilibrium will hit at some point.
It's fascinating because you started your career really working with those international remote teams, those geographically distributed teams. Are you seeing now, so if we settle in at, somewhere between 20 and 30%, are you seeing differences around the world?
So differences in terms of numbers or in terms of, the level of interest in this? I mean,
Yes,
just,
both.
yes,
Like,
all of the
are you
above.
right?
Yeah,
I think it's all pretty interesting. Are
Yeah.
different countries, for instance, I know you can't really generalize to a country, but are countries having a sort of a differential on how many individuals, like what percentage do you think it will level to?
Yeah.
Or are there just cross-cultural differences in
Sure.
the uptake of virtual work and remote work? Are there cultural differences in leadership demanding people come back to
Right,
work?
right,
So I'm just curious
absolutely.
if what your
Yeah.
lens is on the sort
So,
of the global.
I will say this has been a little bit of a research holy grail for me and others, in that there isn't really good there's pretty substantial tracking of remote work in the US now, particularly post-pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, you could get to a reasonably robust estimate. Internationally, outside of the US, globally, it's been very, very much more difficult, and every country sort of uses its own, measurement system. So I'm a little hesitant to talk
Right, no,
about
that's
like
fair.
exact numbers for other countries.
That's fair.
What I will say that I have seen, as I've worked, because I have worked with some companies in other countries, and to a lesser degree done some research on those countries. But I think what I've seen is really three main things. So one is, I think first of all, I mean, I think one thing that has really fascinated me, because I had during the pandemic, I had a number of actually consulting clients who were in Europe, who were located in Europe. And something that I learned very quickly, which had not been apparent to me in the US, is the extent to which remote work and virtuality in general at work has been legislated there through either unions and or the government, labor law, as opposed to letting the free market sort of work it out, which is what in the U.S., where we have many fewer labor laws, or you might say much laxer labor laws, that we're essentially letting supply and demand kind of work out how much remote work people are able to do, and what jobs enable remote work and so forth.
So legislation is a big one that's dictating sort of how much of this is happening.
A second one is technological infrastructure, and that has always existed, but it laid bare some really significant differences during the pandemic, in that you had countries where people were almost immediately able to just go home, work reasonably comfortably. It may not have felt comfortable to them with their kids at home, but reasonably securely and comfortably and effectively at home. Whereas in countries where there was weaker technological infrastructure, and by that I primarily mean high-speed internet, right? That those countries really struggled, and to some extent had employees coming in during the pandemic because there was no other choice. Otherwise, there was just no way to get work done. So there was a really big difference there. I think now that we're kind of mostly post-pandemic, you see that is changing a little bit, in that countries that have the ability to get high-speed internet to their employees' residences, in some cases are completely fine with their employees staying remote because it saves them a ton of commuting time, right? And so sometimes it's fine. Other times, though, even sometimes within the same country, if you have an area that is much more technologically disadvantaged, then you'll have employers saying, sorry, you got to come back in.
Right. That makes sense. And what about culture?
Yeah,
so I understand there's the labor laws and issues of law, and certainly technology, which presumably that will get better over time. Mm-hmm. But culture, that's a tougher one, right?
That culture is a tougher one. The big difference that I've seen cross-culturally is what in academia we call power distance. You could think of it more, just sort of more simply as hierarchy, right? And so cultures that value hierarchy more and that rely on hierarchy more as a way to manage, they tend to be cultures where managers are less comfortable giving employees autonomy, and where managers are more comfortable having what we call sort of physical oversight over employees, or presence-based oversight, where you're managing by, looking at somebody as opposed to managing to results, right? And so in more hierarchical cultures, we have seen more resistance to remote work. I think, I will say there's one exception to that, which is, multinational companies. So if you have a company that comes from a lower hierarchy culture, it is possible that has, sort of transmitted, that culture has been effectively transferred over to a higher, hierarchical country culture.
That makes perfect sense, because that's what we know about culture, right? It's socialized. So socializing agent is the company itself. Exactly. So the company itself is socializing the people who work, regardless if they're in a hierarchical national culture, right? Yeah. So, but the interesting part is that, socialization and what are organizations doing and what's unique to those companies, right? Mm-hmm. Is there something, training, development, something they can be doing either at the team level or the leadership level to help individuals have a better, more successful experience working in a remote environment?
There are, a set of skills. It's interesting. Erin McCarius, who I mentioned previously, and I did, we found a survey that had been done in 2006 of companies, mostly here in the U.S., but some were multinationals, and the training that they had done for virtual work. So this isn't work from home. This is the type of virtual work that you're talking about on global teams. And we found that only about a third, or they found that in 2006, that only about a third of companies were doing any kind of training. And of that third, the vast majority were only training in technology and policies, right? So, cybersecurity and so forth. So we set out in 2018, so this is pre-pandemic, we set out to essentially replicate that survey. And so we did a similar survey, similar number of companies, and amazingly to us, we found almost identical results, that only about 30% of companies were doing any kind of training, and of that, a tiny minority were training on anything except technology. What we know from decades of research, quite frankly, long precede the pandemic, is that the key tools or skills to really succeeding in a virtual environment are really what we call socio-emotional, right? That they have very much to do with the way people behave, the way they communicate with each other, and the relationships that they build with each other. And of course, the technology is important. Comfort with technology is also important, but the make or break is really in these socio-emotional skills. And so I can, if you want, I can get into that a little bit more detail.
I would love to hear more about the training itself. So what do you train to help individuals gain those socio-emotional skills in order to be better as a virtual team member or a global team member?
Absolutely. And I'll say that a lot of the same skills that I'll talk about in that context also apply to what a lot of us are dealing these days with, which is managing in a hybrid environment. So even if it's not cross-cultural, even if it's just people working from home, many of the same skills and teachings apply. And so I think, one of the big ones is information sharing. So one of the big challenges of not being in the same place at the same time, right? You and I can share a document if we want to. If we're virtual, then we have to figure out another way to share information. One of the things that research, sort of identified long ago, is that in a virtual setting, people are less likely to share sufficient information. And so...
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by sufficient?
Well, so there are a couple different types of information, right? There's task-related information, which is just, information about what we need to do. That is more likely to get shared sufficiently. But then there's also situational information. There's information about just my own context, what's going on right now, right? Which could be, my boss is breathing down my neck about something, my kid is sick today, I'm on a deadline, anything like that. Those are much more likely that's information that is much more likely to be shared organically, or just naturally in a face-to-face setting. Whereas if we're on, email, it's very unlikely that that'll get shared unless the two people already have a close relationship.
A trusting relationship.
Exactly.
I know trust is a big part of this.
Trust is a big part. And so part of the of the sort of learning about how to be a good virtual worker is just understanding the need to share so much more information, and to share it, even with task information, to share it more often. And so don't assume that just because you said something once, that it has been fully absorbed the way it might have been if you had it in a one-to-one conversation.
Boy, that's just a great piece of advice overall, not to assume people are understanding and hearing exactly what you've communicated inside. Right?
So that's one. I think another one then is really establishing social interaction between virtual counterparties or virtual team members. So and again, this is something that tends to happen organically when we're face to face, right? Before we started this recording, you and I were chatting about all kinds of stuff. And, and I think because we are used to working virtually a lot, we probably would have done that if this were a Zoom call, right? But a lot of times people don't. They feel uncomfortable. They feel like the Zoom call sort of limits their ability to share, especially if they don't know each other well. And so they won't make small talk. And what happens is small talk has this really important role in work, right? And so if you don't have social interaction, which is interaction that does not involve the work, right? If you don't have that, it is much less likely that you're going to develop trust in each other, and also what's called social cohesion, which is just
common ground. Can you
exactly
provide
that's
emotional support, tangible support, whatever it might
huge
be.
part.
It's human to human, and that's how, like you said, that's how we build trust.
Exactly. So trust, social cohesion, these come out a lot, as you said, of finding similarities, points of similarity with each other. If we find a point of similarity, even if it's relatively cosmetic, right? Like, there's one example that's given in a video that I use for teaching, which is, oh, I love potato chips. Oh, I do too. Right. So it can be even relatively superficial. It has to be genuine, but it actually serves as a way to establish relationship, to establish what's called liking, right? And then that goes to establishing more productive work relationships. So social interaction often falls by the wayside in virtual work settings, especially if it's a team. So one thing that's really important is whoever is sort of either the formal leader or the de facto leader of a given team gathering, if it's virtual, is to make sure that some of that type of interaction takes place. A lot of times what people do, and have been doing long before the pandemic, is just saying, we're going to spend the first 5 or 10 minutes talking, just seeing how everybody's doing, just doing a check-in, right? Or sometimes they'll say, we're gonna highlight an office, one office in our global team, or a team member. We're going to highlight them for 5 minutes at the beginning, different person each meeting. But that way, I do. I mean, there's a very common icebreaker that a lot of people use, which is, tell me something about yourself that most people here are unlikely to know, right?
Right.
And you'd be amazed at the relationships that form out of that, because suddenly people are discovering similarities in people that they thought they had nothing in common with previously.
Do I do that still with my MBA classes at the start of each class? Hey, you sit with somebody you don't know,
right?
And what's the most interesting or unusual thing you have in common? It's amazing what they can come up with in 3 to 5 minutes. So this doesn't take forever, but it's a great piece of advice.
It's a really small investment of time and zero investment, essentially, of money, and yet it can have an enormous, impact. I think the other thing that I talk about a lot, which is very sort of psychology driven, but one thing that we have learned over the years is that when people are virtual, and this is particularly true if they are on email or telephone, where you have fewer visual cues, the more that you take away visual cues, the greater people are to engage in something called fundamental attribution error.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
Which is a big problem,
big
right?
problem, right?
So
psychologist to psychologist, it's a big problem. So tell us about the problem.
Simply put, fundamental attribution error is a tendency that almost everybody has, which is that if you see something especially something you don't like in somebody else, is to immediately assume that thing is somehow a signal of their fundamental character as a person. So you tend to attribute behavior, particularly behavior that you don't like, to internal reasons. So that's just the type of person they are, as opposed to external reasons, which could be, maybe their boss yelled at them. Maybe they didn't get enough sleep last night. Maybe they're not feeling well, right? And so we have and everybody does this. I use the example often of road rage, right? If somebody cuts you off on the highway, you're probably not sitting there going, oh gosh, maybe they have a relative in the hospital, right? You're probably going in a different direction. That's a classic example of fundamental attribution error. Turns out that in virtual work, especially when we have limited visual cues, and less rich media, right? It's very likely that it's more likely that you will engage in fundamental attribution error. And so if a great example, albeit an extreme example of this, is any comment section of any website or, any social media comment section that you can find these days, right? That it usually takes about 5 posts before it devolves into some kind of ad hominem assumptions about somebody, right?
Except for this podcast. Everyone's going to keep it.
The comments here, right. We're in a different situation here. But if you think about that in a work context, if you have an email chain and you think about that kind of dynamic happening and people not realizing the greater risk of that, then it can become toxic very quickly. And so that's something else, as I teach people, is just talking about those types of effects which happen to everybody. It's not anybody's fault. It doesn't make them a bad person, but being aware of it, and it really helps you to be able to counteract it.
It's just our primitive brains responding to subjective norms that you've been translating. I had an interesting one fairly recently where we were on a Zoom call with multiple people, somewhere in the United States, somewhere in Europe, and it was early for a few of the Americans. The Americans had, they had their sweatshirts on, their hoodies. They were kind of just woke up.
Right.
So one of them was actually eating breakfast cereal, which was, the American efficiency. This was a perfectly good approach, but I'm watching the look on the Europeans' faces, and they were well dressed. At least from the waist up, they looked presentable, like ready for business. And like you said, that attribution of who's really here prepared and being professional, those are subjective assessments. So I just think that one's a really important one.
And that's an interesting example, because there you have the visual information, and that's the bit that is probably causing people to fall into attribution error, and that's where situational information becomes really important. And I'll say there's one other thing that I often teach is the importance of discussing differences in norms as a team forms, especially if it is cross-cultural. And I think your example that you gave there is a great one, right? Of, okay, so this is how we do things in America. We tend to be somewhat utilitarian, efficiency-driven. We may get on, if it's an early meeting, we may not be formally dressed, right? We may be eating breakfast. But that doesn't mean that we're unprofessional or that we don't care, right? Because it could send the message to somebody who's more traditional, sort of European context, that, this person was really, the informality may connote to them, some kind of lack of caring. And so I think, setting those, establishing those differences, recognizing them, acknowledging them early on, and discussing them, then helps take a lot of the power of those things to divide people out of the equation later on.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot with my clients as well. We're doing a lot of exactly what you're describing, looking at these differences in formality, informality, communication style, use of silence, and the like, and looking at the full distribution of the team on those dimensions, and then talking about it and saying, okay, just can we minimally understand that there's variance here, and what does that look like?
Absolutely.
And that seems to be a great practice that we're seeing with our clients. Barbara, I'm curious, you talk about something called virtual intelligence. Is it the understanding of all of these things?
Virtual intelligence is really to communicate the idea that there are individual skills that can make somebody more effective at virtual work. So it really the term came about at a time when Erin and I in particular, were finding that there was so much attention on teams and team leadership and team dynamics, and very little on just virtual work. And if you think about, people who sit in offices all day long often spend most of their days conducting virtual work. And, because it's really the use of technology tools to communicate with people who are elsewhere. And so you don't have to be working from home in order to be engaging in virtual work. And what we were finding is that most of the attention was going to structures that were either like formal work from home, telecommuting structures, or these global virtual teams that already were getting a lot of sort of organizational recognition and organizational support. And we said, gee, that's great, but guess what? There are a lot of other people sitting in offices who are struggling with virtual work, in part because it hasn't been pointed out to them that they're doing it. And therefore, they haven't been paying attention to the differences between virtual interaction and in-person interaction. And so that's a lot of how this idea of virtual intelligence came about, that in fact there are things, big one is recognizing the differences. So we just talked about that, recognizing, oh, I'm in a virtual setting, I'm more likely to fall victim to, or be vulnerable to fundamental attribution error, right? And so just that recognition alone often then kind of pulls people back from the edge of the cliff and helps them then go to the next step, which is I need to share information much more deliberately, much more with much more intentionality, and much more frequently than I would if I were just sitting next to the person. Because a lot of things that they would gather, especially the situational information, is not going to come across unless I'm much more overt about it. So there's skills like that that really came into this idea of virtual intelligence. And it really is an intelligence the way that cultural intelligence is, or emotional intelligence, in that it's a contextualized, it's a specific intelligence related to a particular context, but it is also learnable. And so it's not innate.
It's so critical, right? Both instructing on that fundamental attribution error, but frankly, it's just the self-awareness that this is occurring, but also the skills you need in order to over-communicate and communicate again and again, content that you might not need to if you were in a face-to-face environment. That's so critical. I'm wondering how, though, all of this, so the virtual intelligence, all of this great training that we can do to make remote work, virtual work, geographically distributed work, global teams, make it all better. But what is remote work or virtual work doing to corporate cultures? Do you think there's an effect there?
That's a great question. Absolutely. This is one of the biggest pain points that I hear in my exec ed, my consulting, my graduate students. Everybody comes and says, my graduate students who are currently working, they all say, just corporate culture has really kind of just, it has just become lighter. It's just become more ephemeral, harder to understand, harder to identify. This is particularly difficult for new employees who come in needing that, sort of indoctrination into corporate culture.
Culture is transmitted human to human,
that's
right?
and they're not getting it. So, a lot of what I've been, in fact, I was just, working on an executive education project with a company, a financial services company, and a large part of what we've been talking about is how do you, think about how you communicate culture within your office, right? We often call them artifacts, right? What are the observable signs of culture in your office? And now think about somebody who is working remotely or working, in a different office in a different part of the globe that may not have these same, have the benefit of a large, sort of corporate office. How do those artifacts, how do you translate those artifacts or transfer the ideas underpinning those artifacts to a remote setting? Because artifacts, and I know I don't need to tell you this of all people, but artifacts are really signals of the norms and the values of an organization. And so norms being how we expect people to behave, and values being what our priorities are, what we think is important, what we think is right, and what we're willing to trade off other things for, most importantly, right? What we think is really most important. So how do you transmit that information to somebody who's in another country or in another location or working from home all the time? And so, a lot of what's going on now is people trying to figure all of that out. And I think that, again, there's, I suspect that you have ideas that I haven't even run into yet, but the things that I typically talk about are, again, being much more explicit about culture as opposed to letting people sort of absorb it on their own. It's much more important. And some companies were doing this already, right? You look at like Amazon. I mean, they have their principles. They've been talking overtly about culture for years. And, so it's out there already. But companies that haven't been doing that have let culture be kind of just a thing that's out there that employees figure out on their own as they get into the company, that doesn't work in a remote setting. And so it's much more important to be explicit, to be overt about really talking about what your norms and values are. But having said that, there are still ways to bring, artifacts of culture into, a remote setting. And, there are, meetings are a great time to do that, virtual meetings, team meetings, sometimes even in the activities that you choose to do in those meetings, social activities that you choose to do, even those 10-minute check-ins, all of those can be ways to transmit culture. I've been doing recently some work with a company, I guess I'll call them an industrial services company, that has all kinds of virtual meetings, and every single meeting they start with a safety moment. And that's because safety is an enormous part of their corporate culture, incredibly important, right? And it's basically, safety and profitability, right? I mean, those are the two. And so to start every single business meeting with a safety moment and asking people, so tell me our safety principle of this month is, and they have like 5 safety principles, and they, each month is a different one, right? And so how do you, how do you transmit that? Well, you ask people, tell me about how, a safety moment that you had, office worker working from home, right? And you'll have people saying, oh, my kid was running in the kitchen and I had to go check and make sure the oven was on. But it's a way of getting that mindset transferred outside of a typical office setting.
It's such great ways to think about org culture, because my sense, at least with my clients, I'm seeing a lot of companies saying, wow, similar to yours, our culture just feels like it's been diluted. Our culture just doesn't feel like it's as strong. And, I keep going back to, hey, culture is a learned phenomenon. So the fact that we can do some of this remotely is really exciting. So, Barbara, one last question for you. What's next? Like, what do you see? Can you predict the future for us a little bit about, I know, remote virtual work, right?
Yeah.
What's coming around the corner?
I mean, I think sort of there's like a short term and then a medium term and then maybe another medium term or a longer term. So I think that the short term, as I already alluded to earlier, I think the next couple of years are going to be largely about figuring out some of these problems that we've been talking about, right? Culture onboarding is one that we didn't get to, but is also a big issue. People are getting better and better at it, but those problems and finding an equilibrium in the labor market, that's going to be the other big piece in the next couple of years. So I think we're going to, the market is going to figure out what, are we going to go into a recession in the US? Globally, are we going to go into a recession? I don't know. If we do, it's likely that will right some of the imbalances in the labor market, and then we'll see what sort of long-term remote work policy looks like. So I think that's going to be one that's going to be really front and center for the next 2 to 3 years, say. I think another piece that was really starting to pick up steam and surprisingly actually seems, in my mind at least, to have gone to the back burner a little bit in the last couple of years with the pandemic is the use of immersive technologies in remote and virtual, and especially in global virtual teams.
Right.
And so that's something that is definitely, I mean, I think anybody working in that field would be like, what do you mean it's not on the back burner? I know, I mean, there have definitely been advances made, and some companies have really been moving into that space themselves for their own teams, right, and adopting some of these technologies. But I think that they're not still where they really need to be in order to be more than kind of a novelty or kind of an interesting
and
thing.
What's it going to do for trust?
And exactly, what is it really going to do over a long period of time, as opposed to just kind of a fun thing to play with once in a while. And so I think that, also though, I will say one thing that immersive technologies have been doing a lot of is during the pandemic, augmented reality has made huge inroads in enabling some manufacturing jobs to be done remotely. And so that, I think, is something that we really saw a huge pickup in the last couple of years. And I suspect that is probably going to move faster than let's put on our VR headsets, as a global virtual team. And then, I think beyond that, I think the other big open question to me is the trend of work from anywhere. So we've talked a lot about working at home, but something that had started in around 2010, 2012 to become a little bit more popular, and that was really starting to make inroads and then made more inroads during the pandemic, was allowing people not only to work from home, but to live anywhere that they want, sometimes within the same country, but giving them geographic flexibility. There's been some research that I was involved in a couple of years ago with pre-pandemic data showed that for certain workers, taking them from just work from home and then enabling them to live anywhere they wanted would actually increase their productivity.
Interesting.
Because they were able to balance, all aspects of their life by living where they wanted to. But I think there's still an open question about what the equilibrium is there as well. And so I think that we will see, again, as we get to a true post-pandemic state, we'll see whether that continues to grow the way that work from home did, or whether it sort of levels off at a very small proportion of the workforce.
Barbara, this has been fantastic. I mean, all the things you're describing, it is a watch this space, right? How is the market going to shake out? Supply
There's
and demand.
a lot to come.
The whole virtual reality, augmented, technologies. That's a really exciting area. I think even the basics of the training that you were describing, I think all of this is so exciting. So thank you so much for being a guest on International Business Today.
Thank you.
Thank you. To our listeners, thank you for being a part of International Business Today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to it and share it with anyone who might also like to have this cutting edge knowledge. Thank you.